Hello everyone and welcome back to season 2 of the PGN Podcast. This podcast has one simple message: to normalise the conversation on resilience, our environment and our future in a climate changed world, with our communities at the heart of it all. Our primary goal is to foster discussions about flooding, climate resilience and related environmental issues to better support communities. We're here to take a deeper dive into the conversations we began in season 1. We will be connecting hearts and minds, ambition, passion alongside our community and experts. Together we'll work towards building a more resilient future in our ever-changing world. I am Meshi Taka, the project lead for Project Groundwater in Northumbria, which is what PGN stands for, and your host for this season. Let's jump right in. Approximately 5.2 million people in England are at risk of flooding from rivers and the sea. Vulnerable communities, which can include low-income households, elderly people, and those living with disabilities, are disproportionately affected by flooding. Public engagement in flood, energy, and climate resilience in England has been increasing over the years, particularly following the significant events and growing awareness on climate change and its impact. Challenges remain, including disparities in knowledge and resources across different communities. This episode will consider the importance of prioritising community engagement and empowerment for achieving effective and sustainable climate action. Today's guest is the fantastic Ned Gatenby. Hi Ned, welcome.
Hello Meshi, thank you for having me.
So Ned, tell our audience a bit about the work you do. Who are you?
Sure, will do. So I'm here from Business in the Community. We are the King's Responsible Business Network, which means that since the 1980s, we've been sort of facilitating a strengthened relationship between businesses and communities, where those businesses are kind of committed to social value and positive impact and all sorts of nice things like that. So I joined Business in the Community in June 2024, so still quite new on the turf. After sort of 9 years of a mix of freelance and employed work in carbon literacy training, climate change engagement, and net zero advocacy across kind of public sector, private sector, and community groups as well. I always sort of felt one step removed from the action. So when I joined BITC, it was kind of really to get stuck into some of the doing. BITC has a project called the Community Climate Fund. The Community Climate Fund is an accessible source of funding for community-oriented organisations, and the aim is to improve community-level resilience against the environmental and economic shocks associated with climate change, improve the transition to net zero to make sure that it's inclusive and fair across all of the communities in the UK, and to help augment some kind of sense of community well-being and cohesion so that those communities really kind of get to know each other, re-establish familial links with the people that we live alongside. And really, it's kind of the position I'm in. We're an intermediary between the businesses with well-intentioned commitments to the environment and social impact and the communities with the greatest need for inclusion in the just transition. So that's sort of really where I'm about.
I mean, that's a lot. We obviously met at the Yorkshire Sustainability Festival, try and get those letters out. And when we're talking about communities and the role they can play in getting us over the line when we talk about climate action, and I know that's something you were passionate about before you went to BITC. So for those joining in, when we refer to community action, what is it and why is it so important?
Oh, that's such a big question. I love it. I think I'll start with the second part. The reason community action is so important is because really communities are the building blocks of our society. So I think when we're sort of approaching the issue of community action in relation to things like climate change, as flooding is very closely linked, but also other things like the cost of living crisis, which is really intrinsically linked with climate change as well, which I'll come on to, I'm sure, in a moment. I think the attention tends to be sort of top level, quite high in scale, large and ethereal, and really quite unrelatable to your everyday person. But if we turn the focus to community level stuff, then community action really becomes the mechanism for widespread positive and inclusive change. So some of those larger challenges that we're facing really play out on a community level, and we need to be present and active at a community level while having those top level conversations in order to get any sort of sense of progress towards, you know, a better tomorrow, which I guess is really what we're all after.
I think ultimately as well, communities are a key decision maker. You can drive down policies, but they need to live it. So if they don't buy into the notion, or if they feel like those processes, policies are not for them, then it could be as brilliant as possible in your mind, but it doesn't meet their needs, and you end up with, like we talked, disparities amongst communities. But you did mention about cost of living, because there's an issue around accessibility and affordability, and that there are communities out there, and I mentioned vulnerable communities that have other more, say, urgent but more pressing, imminent concerns, and making the choice for climate action, even if they believe in it, might not be something they can afford to do.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really key kind of really key point to address here is, I suppose, when we're thinking about kind of success in terms of policy design and process and inclusion, anything that you set out to do for people without including those people from the very start of the process, whether it's design or decision, is, well, essentially doomed to fail, because what you're doing is setting out with a set of assumptions about the community, the people that you're seeking to make a change for, and unless you challenge those assumptions and make sure that they're correct, you're leading yourself down the wrong path. So by bringing communities in as kind of a core part of the conversation from the very start, and designing that in rather than having it as a nice to have or an add-on later or retrofitted in, it really makes sure that whatever policy or process you're designing is there to address the real concerns. Because as you've mentioned about the cost of living crisis, what it does is it brings people's daily concerns, daily priorities to the very forefront, so that you're kind of limiting your ability to look far into the future and prepare for the things that we as a global community might know are coming. But what does that mean for everyday me? It doesn't really matter if I can't afford to put my heating on this winter, or if I can't find food that's available because the supply to the supermarkets is dwindling and
Other
things
prices
like that.
have gone up.
I think the exercise of community-led action is very much about connecting those dots from the larger scale to the everyday, and making sure that we can approach both sides simultaneously.
And there's a piece there which kind of leads into the second part of our questioning around that early engagement. So working with communities as opposed to telling them what they need is an element of being seen and valued and heard. And it helps with engagement. Talk us through the values or the kind of factors that can influence effective community engagement, the onboarding, getting people on side when we talk about climate action.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect way to approach this kind of issue of community action, because without engaged communities, we're not going to be taking any action led by communities. I think if I might start with some of the mistakes I think that generally we tend to make habitually, is first and foremost using the wrong sort of language. Most important issues that have a lot of research go into them, a lot of policy around them and things, tend to be peppered with a lot of jargon. So kind of in the circles that I move in, a lot of what we talk about is improving energy efficiency of homes, and the big buzzword there is retrofit. But you as an organisation go to any homeowner anywhere, and more often than not, the word retrofit is going to turn them right off. They're not interested in learning what it is, not interested in understanding about it, because it doesn't mean anything to most people unless you run in the circles that talk about retrofit all the time. So that's just kind of one example of kind of the need to de-jargon our language when we're operating on a community level, for certain. In my work, particularly kind of with the Community Climate Fund around Bradford, most of the conversations I have, we're not even really talking about climate change at all, even though the solutions that we're going to come to are in effect reducing carbon emissions or improving energy efficiency or all of this. What we're really talking about is reducing operating costs for community organisations, and that's the level of conversation that we're having. What we then come to with the solutions is something that almost by accident but on purpose has those kind of climate positive impacts as well. So it's a way to shift the language. And I think another really key thing as well on language while we're here is trying as much as possible to reduce this kind of us and them conversation that tends to happen when large organisations or high level governments start to talk about quite granular communities. It very much is a habit of most to start saying, well, we're going to do this for you and them in this place. And it makes people strangers, it makes people others to each other, where if we kind of shift our language ever so slightly, we can start to use it to build bridges and establish trust. And I think that's really, really crucial, certainly in the early days, but ongoing as you're trying to implement or effect positive change at a community level. I could go on.
Please do. Please do.
As when we're influencing community engagement, facts and research are really important. So understanding the needs at the level of the community that you're trying to operate in is really, really crucial. But then when communicating about those needs to the communities, maybe start with questions rather than facts and figures. Try to make sure that the language of those facts and figures and the way that they're presented is accessible rather than inaccessible, and most crucially relevant to what you're trying to talk to. So I always start with questions and try to understand kind of what level does this community organisation want to talk to me on, and I'll approach the issues from there. And I think that's a great way to go forward as well. And then once you kind of got that and you're able to establish some good relationships and get things going, you get a foothold in one, and it's far easier to spread that impact and scale things up and multiply your efforts into other communities, other community organisations, other local areas, purely by storytelling. And this certainly doesn't need to be a case of, I came in here and I did all of this work and these are the impacts we've had, but actually using the means of storytelling to platform the right voices and bring kind of real people's lives to the work that you've done. So talking less about the process of retrofit to these buildings, but what did person who uses this community centre experience before we did this intervention? What do they experience now? How has things changed? And really use the stories of real people, I think, and real work that gets done to add, I suppose, beauty to the work you're trying to do, because that is really what gets people going. Take away the process, take away the boring stuff, and find a way to make it beautiful.
Community empowerment, it's looking at it from what they need. You talked about like immediate needs and long-term needs. Start from their point of view, and then they become part of the journey because they invested in what you're doing, because it obviously helps them in a way that means something to them as opposed to whatever it means to us. And I mean, we've talked about things like awareness campaigns and initiatives and education programs, but it's the same theme, isn't it? It's the running theme, the kind of storytelling thing, and having them inform us in the language in which they need that information. When we talk about community empowerment, so giving communities the resources and support to lead the way, to take ownership of the action. How do we go about that?
Yeah, I love the word empowerment, I think, particularly on a community level, because I think the difference between someone who's disempowered and someone who is empowered is not necessarily having more access to more things. Like, you don't have to be the wealthiest person to feel empowered to do what you need to do, but it's more a feeling of what you're able to achieve based on the resources and the information that you've got at the time, I suppose. And I think exercises by organizations who want to, progress changes. I think the empowerment piece is not so much always going to be providing this thing that communities then become reliant on or dependent on, but actually finding ways for communities to provide this thing themselves and for that to become self-sustaining. That's really what I think the goal of empowerment should be. It should go, empowerment to resilience, and that resilience piece, I think, can only really come after empowerment conversations happen.
Our love for jargon, and also the fact that we have these circles that we network in all the time, is part of that transparency in what we're doing, and just opening up these spaces and bringing people in that wouldn't necessarily be in those spaces, but also going to spaces where we wouldn't necessarily go in the first place unless we were looking for a specific outcome. So removing the kind of exclusivity a little bit that happens when people talk about climate change or related action to climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. This idea of openness, I think, is definitely something that's intrinsic to any kind of progress in the realm of action on climate change at a community level. There's a tendency, kind of particularly in the business world, I think there's an expectation that if somebody wants to be somewhere to get some piece of information, they will be willing to travel or to log in online, which, when you're being paid to do so, is perfectly reasonable expectation, I think. Where that falls down when we're talking about action at a community level is that most people who are taking action on a community level are likely doing it voluntary. They're giving up their time because they feel passionate, they see a need, and they want to do something about it. And so in an exercise where we, the organisation, are trying to mobilize people at a community level or support that action on a community level, it's very, very important that we go to the spaces that they're already operating in. So it's not my job to organize an event that community organizations can attend, as much as it is my job to go to those community organizations, knock on doors, and start those conversations directly myself. And I think that also then adds to the sense, this growing sense of trust between us as an organisation and communities who might benefit from the support that we're seeking to provide.
Does that include community funding for community action groups though? Typically, passionate individuals or passionate groups usually form in response to an event or something, and they drive this where communities have some kind of support which is led by themselves, but it's generally speaking not funded, so it's in your spare time or making a decision to use your own unpaid time to focus on this. And I guess when we talk about community empowerment and supporting spaces like this, we live in a capitalist world. So surely creating funding where it is, yes, it's a passion and it's for a good cause, but recognizing that people need a living as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the biggest challenges in the sector that we're trying to, the community level sector, is so predominantly voluntary led, because of the very reason that it's often in response to a particular need that's not being delivered by whatever system we live in the location that it's needed. And honestly, if you've got an answer to how we can make sure that everybody giving their valuable time to local granular issues can be reimbursed for their time in some way, then I'd love to know it. But I think this is where I think our position as business in the community really offers value, because there are businesses out there and large organizations who have budget ready for social value, and having me in place and my colleagues at other places around the UK, boots on the ground, speaking to people every day, finding out what their needs are, we've got that avenue to get money from businesses operating in a capitalist society with a bit of spare budget there, right to where it needs to be, based on the needs that are self-identified, rather than businesses saying, I've got a bit of money for some solar panels for some community organizations, go and find some. It's, I've got some money, will you please do what's best for it? And that's kind of the mechanism I'm operating in, but it's certainly not something that is system wide. It's not changing the world, but it is changing local areas.
I would say though it's a good start. It's good to know that there are businesses, organizations out there that are enabling that connection. But we have seen special grants for certain types of renewable energies. For example, like I was thinking about solar panels, and there was something a few years ago about having electric charge points and things. So those funding pots do pop up. I guess my point is around consistency. The apprenticeship levy, for example, is a good example, I'll say template, where previous to that, we had employers who would train technicians and stuff, and that was self-funded, and the levy created kind of an equitable centralized pot which made it accessible independent of size of employer, just across the industry, and for lots of different types of professionals and things like that. So there are, I'm not saying exactly the same, but there are examples in other areas. And is it time for us to be looking at something that creates a bit more security, which could then enable or facilitate more of these community-led initiatives? So less about finding the organization that's willing to fund that particular thing, and more about having a centralized funding resource that acknowledges the need for community investment or community-led initiatives as a fundamental tool towards achieving our climate action goals.
Yeah, I think, that sense of the need for longevity, I think, is so important here, to be thinking about when we're thinking about the people that underpin the action that gets done at a community level. And you're right, there's plenty of funds available for specific things all over the place. It's largely place-based, often comes from differing priorities based on local authority, based on local geography, based on all sorts of different things. So you can get very kind of place-specific funds for all sorts. I'll just give an example of why that might not necessarily be the best way forward, I suppose. One community organisation I've been scoping out a project with so far are generally quite good at accessing these grants. I think the grant landscape at the moment is shaped in such a way that as soon as you kind of get the skill, the flavour for how to put together a grant application, success rates skyrocket. I mean, there's a reason that bid writer is a job in many professions, because it is a skill to put together a good bid. But what that does is foster a sense of competitiveness between community organisations who are all jostling for the same small pots of money for specific interventions. One of which, this organisation that I'm working with at the moment, they operate on site out of a handful of porter cabins that have been in place for quite a while, sell different things to communities at an accessible price, make lots of things, provide a space for socialization, new skills, and a lot of local grown food. It's a fantastic site. If anyone ever visits Wibsey Garden in Bradford, I'd recommend it. It's brilliant. So their porter cabin is very leaky at the moment and very expensive to keep warm in the winter. Their grants that were available were an energy audit, which came up with a list of recommendations to help reduce running costs, and one of which was to install solar panels on the roof. But if you've seen this porter cabin, I'm not sure it would support the weight of solar panels. So while they've got money available for some things, what they can't find is any option to fund the replacement of the structure, which is where we've sort of come in, and we're starting to have conversations about some different solutions that might be able to facilitate that. And then they'll be in a position to get those solar panels on that roof, run their community shop without high energy costs and things like that. But because of the piecemeal shape of the funding that's available to them, they can't necessarily get it in the right order. They can't access it very easily. And once they get good at it, it means that other organisations are then pushed out of the running, because one organisation's good at accessing funding and many others are then unsuccessful. Whereas I think the shape of funding, particularly for community-led organisations where things are often voluntary and people are there for passion, not for money, for lack of a better way to put it, would be to enhance the collaborative nature of funding that's available and start really looking at a place-based, system-wide view when designing the way that funds are allocated, and build into that the specific needs of each organisation in their very hyperlocal position with their very hyperlocal needs. And I think that would be a way to both top down and bottom up meet somewhere in the middle with some really exciting ways to make our funding go further and have longer lasting effects.
That's where we have similarities in the flood risk sector, but it's all climate resilience. We talk about nature-based solutions and the multi-lane benefits to provide. We tend to start from a flood risk management point of view, and what we're advocating for is a kind of more holistic and bigger strategic approach. But that also means that we have to tackle those piecemeal pathways. And it was something you and I discussed about, the kind of bombardment. You have to decide, you can't do it all. So we're talking about climate resilience and a system approach and the kind of integrated environment, but our processes, our funding streams are all telling us to pick a lane. What are some other things in your role, because you sit in that space, that we can work with communities to help address some of these concerns? Because some of these systems and pathways are enough to discourage anyone from getting involved. They're fairly major to somebody who's just trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, I think that's a tough nut to crack is this one, this issue that the system that we live in, whether you're looking at the economic system, society as kind of human communities, or the natural system as in, planet Earth, all of these are really complex systems. And what we have a tendency to do when trying to solve a problem is to compartmentalize and pick the issue that we can focus on and focus really well. And while I think that is good to have a focus so that you're not trying to be all things to all people all the time, because that spells disaster as well, because then you end up doing a lot of things not as good as you could have done one thing. What we need to be able to do in our long-term plans for these interventions is to become comfortable in the complexity of things and expect that things are going to have to be done slightly different when we get to that stage, because somebody else is probably focusing on this connected but different issue that we've not chosen to focus on, and have that awareness at each stage of the process that we might have to shift a little bit or mold around someone else's work here in order to make sure that this stuff is complementary of each other and not in competition with each other. And I think that kind of comfort in chaos is something that's difficult to do on an individual level, more difficult to do.
I like difficulter
on an organizational level. And when you're trying to have that conversation with people who've got their own kind of day-to-day high priority, no more energy to be giving extra capacity to this fresh new conversation, that comfort in chaos becomes a very, very difficult thing to track. But I think that's kind of where the importance of trying to have fun with all of this stuff really eases the tension a little bit. And a lot of the stuff in our worlds is quite scary, quite existential, and really could spell disaster in a very real sense. So while we're doing it, like as humans doing it on a day-to-day basis, we do need to remember to build that fun and that sense of enjoyment and purpose into what we're doing. So maybe that's the answer to comforting chaos. I don't know.
Before I let you go, though, we've gone down the, oh my God, it's so scary. So let's make it lighter. For those who are listening to this and still feel a level of disengagement, it's not really my problem, it's their problem. What would we say to them? Why should the normal Joe Blogs on the street look to being part of the solution as part of their community empowerment?
That is a wonderful question. I think that while there are a lot of disengaged people in the world, there are also a lot of very engaged people in the world, and change is happening around us all the time. Part of the reason disengaged people remain disengaged is because they don't know what's going on already. What they see is the scary headlines, the far in the future targets and the top level stuff. What they don't see is the community organizations doing their thing. They don't see all of the people doing good things every day. And so in order to, boost the need for engagement, I think we ourselves need to get better at that storytelling angle, because that's the way that you get to appeal to people.
Get people to care.
And their engagement becomes their choice. It's not me trying to engage you. It's just me telling you about what I'm up to. And I think that's something that we need to get better at as people running in this circle, doing this good work, is remembering to tell people about it. Often we're quite humble.
Well, yeah, being a bit more extrovert, I call it.
You could call it that, yeah.
Thank you, Ned. You've been fantastic. It's been lovely having you with us today. And I'm sure...
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm sure we'll have more conversations about community action, because there's so much more to cover. But it's been amazing having you join us. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you could get me talking, because once I get started, I could go all day,
Well, there might be part 2, so watch this space. For those joining us today, thank you. And if you'd like to find out more about some of the topics we discussed today, check out our notes that will be accompanying this episode. Project Groundwater, aka PGN, is a research and innovation project funded by DEFRA as part of the 200 million Flood and Coastal Innovation Programs managed by the Environment Agency. The programs will drive innovation in flood and coastal resilience and adaptation to a changing climate. This project is led by Gateshead Council with regional and national partners. PGN aims to enhance community resilience by developing and creating, mapping, forecasting and warning systems with a focus on groundwater flood risk, particularly in former mining areas within the region, but also on a national scale. With this funding, we're working on practical, innovative actions and knowledge sharing with our communities at the heart of it all. For more information on PGN, please visit www.pgn.org.uk.